The moment I heard my mother's voice on the other end of the line, I knew my carefully constructed world was about to collapse. It was Tuesday, March 15, 2022, at exactly 3:47 p.m. when the call came through while I was reviewing quarterly reports. In my corner office at Denver Marketing Solutions. The number showed as blocked, but my mother's distinctive voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Emma Catherine Rodriguez, she said, using my full name in that tone. That had terrified me since childhood. The tone that meant she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. We need to talk. Right now. My hands trembled as I set down the marketing analysis I'd been reviewing for our biggest client. 28 years old, successful digital marketing executive, living independently in downtown Denver for 6 years, and still my mother could reduce me to a frightened child with a single phone call. But this time was different. This time, there was something in her voice that went beyond her usual controlling demeanor. This time, she sounded like she held weapons I didn't even know existed. I'm at work, Mom. Can this wait until? Dr. Rebecca Hartwell had some very interesting things to share about your therapy sessions, she interrupted, her words hitting me like physical blows. Particularly about your eating disorder. Your self-harm. Your little suicide attempt that you never bothered to mention to your family. The office around me seemed to tilt sideways. The Denver skyline visible through my floor-to-ceiling windows blurred as my vision narrowed to a single point of focus, the realization that my therapist had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. Dr. Hartwell, the woman I had trusted. With my deepest secrets, my most vulnerable moments, my carefully guarded trauma, had violated every principle of patient confidentiality by discussing my private sessions with my mother. I had started seeing Dr. Hartwell 8 months earlier, when my anxiety and depression had reached a breaking point. After years of struggling with an eating disorder that had nearly killed me in college, episodes of self-harm that I'd hidden from everyone, and a suicide attempt that had landed me in the emergency room with a cover story about food poisoning, I'd finally found the courage to seek professional help. The decision had taken me 3 years to make, and finding a therapist I trusted had taken another 6 months of consultations and false starts. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell came highly recommended. From the Colorado Mental Health Association. Her practice, Hartwell Therapeutic Services, occupied the entire 4th floor of a sleek building in Cherry Creek, Denver's upscale shopping and business district. Her credentials were impeccable: PhD in clinical psychology from Stanford, postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins, 15 years of experience treating anxiety disorders and trauma. More importantly, she had seemed genuinely caring during our initial consultation, someone who understood the complexity of family dynamics and the importance of maintaining boundaries with controlling parents. How did you? I started to ask. But my mother cut me off again. She called me herself. Said she was concerned about your well-being and thought the family should be involved in your treatment. Apparently, you've been lying to us about a lot of things, Emma. Your father and I are driving down from Fort Collins right now. We'll be at your apartment in 2 hours, and we're going to have a serious conversation about getting you some real help. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto my desk as the full magnitude of the betrayal sank in. Dr. Hartwell hadn't just shared general information about my mental health. She had disclosed specific details about my most private struggles, information that I had shared only after months of building trust and feeling safe in what I believed was a confidential therapeutic relationship. She had told my mother about the eating disorder that had controlled my life throughout college, the cutting that had been my secret coping mechanism during high school, and the night 6 months ago when I had swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. And only survived because my upstairs neighbor had found me unconscious in the hallway. These weren't casual observations or general concerns about my well-being. These were detailed, specific revelations about my mental health history that violated every ethical guideline governing the therapeutic relationship. The confidentiality agreement I had signed with Dr. Hartwell explicitly stated that no information about our sessions would be shared with anyone without my written consent, except in cases of imminent danger to myself or others. There had been no such danger. I had been making steady progress in therapy, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and working through my trauma in a safe, supportive environment. My career as a senior marketing strategist at Denver Marketing Solutions had been thriving. I managed accounts worth over $2 million annually, led a team of 8 junior marketers, and had just been promoted to the executive leadership team. My personal life was finally stabilizing after years of chaos. I had a supportive group of friends, a romantic relationship that was growing stronger, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something meaningful and sustainable. All of that was about to crumble because a trusted professional had decided that my mother's perceived right to know outweighed my fundamental right to privacy and self-determination. The eating disorder that I had fought so hard to overcome in private would now become family drama. The self-harm that I had managed to stop through therapy would become evidence of my instability. The suicide attempt that I had survived and was processing in a healthy way would become proof that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own life. My mother, Patricia Rodriguez, was a retired school administrator who had built her identity around controlling every aspect of her family's lives. She had homeschooled me and my younger sister until high school, monitored our friendships throughout our teenage years, and had attempted to dictate our college choices, career paths, and even our romantic relationships. Moving to Denver after college had been my declaration of independence, a way to establish boundaries and build an adult life free from her constant oversight and manipulation. Those boundaries had taken years to establish and maintain. Countless arguments about why I couldn't visit every weekend, why I didn't share details about my dating life, why I needed space to figure out who I was as an independent adult. The move to Denver had saved my mental health by putting physical distance between us, but it had come at the cost of ongoing family tension and my mother's constant accusations that I was being secretive and ungrateful. And now, because of Dr. Hartwell's betrayal, all of that progress was being undone in a single phone call. My mother had ammunition that would justify every boundary violation, every attempt to control my life, every accusation that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. The eating disorder would become evidence that I needed family supervision. The self-harm would prove that I was unstable. The suicide attempt would confirm that I was a danger to myself who required constant monitoring. The irony was devastating. I had sought therapy specifically to develop healthier coping mechanisms and work through the family trauma that had contributed to my mental health struggles. Dr. Hartwell had encouraged me to explore how my mother's controlling behavior had affected my self-esteem and contributed to my need for secrecy and isolation. We had worked on strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries while still having a relationship with my family. Now, that same therapist had demolished those boundaries by sharing my most private information with the very person I was trying to protect myself from. I tried calling Dr. Hartwell's office immediately, but the receptionist said she was in session and couldn't be disturbed. I left 3 urgent messages requesting an emergency callback, each one becoming more desperate as I tried to understand how this violation of confidentiality had occurred. Had there been some misunderstanding? Had my mother somehow manipulated Dr. Hartwell into believing I had given consent for this disclosure? Had something happened that made Dr. Hartwell believe I was in immediate danger? The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Our last session, just 3 days earlier, had been one of our most positive. I had shared how much progress I felt I was making, how my coping mechanisms were becoming stronger, how I was finally feeling hopeful about my future. There had been no indication of crisis, no suggestion that I needed additional support or family involvement. I had been stable, motivated, and actively engaged in my recovery process. My coworkers began to notice something was wrong as I sat staring at my phone, waiting for Dr. Hartwell to call back. Marcus Thompson, my assistant marketing manager, knocked on my office door with questions about the Henderson Industries campaign we were supposed to present the following morning. I could barely focus on his words as he explained concerns about the budget allocation and timeline for the social media component. My mind was consumed with trying to figure out how I was going to handle my mother's imminent arrival and what I was going to say to defend myself against accusations based on information that should never have been shared. The Henderson Industries account was worth $1.2 million annually and represented our agency's largest client acquisition in 5 years. I had spent 3 months developing the integrated marketing strategy that would launch their new product line nationwide. The presentation tomorrow was supposed to be the culmination of my work and a major step forward in my career trajectory. Instead, I was going to have to find a way to focus on defending my privacy rights while maintaining my professional responsibilities. By 4:30 p.m., Dr. Hartwell still hadn't returned my calls. I had left 6 messages, each one more frantic than the last, demanding an explanation for what had happened and why my confidentiality had been violated. The receptionist continued to insist that Dr. Hartwell was unavailable and would call back when possible, but her tone had grown increasingly cold and dismissive with each call. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an emergency situation. This was a deliberate decision to share my private information with my mother, a decision that violated every ethical principle governing the therapeutic relationship. The drive home to my apartment in Capitol Hill felt like a funeral procession. Every traffic light, every pedestrian crossing, every normal moment of Denver life seemed surreal against the backdrop of my imploding privacy and autonomy. I had chosen this neighborhood specifically because it was diverse, accepting, and far enough from my family to provide genuine independence. The vintage brick building that housed my one-bedroom apartment had been my sanctuary, the first place I had ever lived that felt truly mine. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Now my parents were driving down from Fort Collins, armed with information that would transform my safe space into a battleground. They would arrive with accusations, demands, and the absolute certainty that they knew what was best for my life. My mother would use Dr. Hartwell's disclosures to justify every boundary violation she had ever attempted, every attempt to control my decisions, every argument we had ever had about my need for independence and privacy. The apartment that had been my refuge for 2 years suddenly felt like a trap. The carefully chosen furniture that reflected my personal style, the artwork I had collected from local Denver artists, the kitchen where I had learned to cook healthy meals as part of my recovery process, all of it would be contaminated by this invasion of my privacy and the confrontation that was about to unfold. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, still hoping that Dr. Hartwell would call with some explanation that would make this nightmare make sense. Maybe there had been a miscommunication. Maybe my mother had misunderstood something. Maybe there was some emergency I wasn't aware of that had justified this breach of confidentiality. But as the minutes ticked by and my phone remained silent, the reality became increasingly clear. My therapist had betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible, and there was no explanation that would make that acceptable. The sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot below my window announced my parents' arrival 45 minutes earlier than expected. Through my second-floor window, I could see my mother marching toward the building entrance with the determined stride of someone who believed she was on a rescue mission. My father followed behind her, looking uncomfortable but resigned to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. In her hand, my mother carried a manila folder that I assumed contained notes from her conversation with Dr. Hartwell, documentation of my private struggles that she would now use as evidence against me. The knock on my door came at exactly 6:15 p.m., sharp and insistent in a way that demanded immediate response. When I opened it, my mother pushed past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, her eyes already scanning my living space for signs of the instability that Dr. Hartwell had apparently described to her. My father offered an apologetic shrug as he followed her inside, but his expression made it clear that he supported whatever intervention they had planned. "We need to talk about Dr. Hartwell's call," my mother announced, settling into my favorite armchair as if she owned the place. "She's very concerned about your mental state, Emma. She thinks you might need inpatient treatment." The intervention lasted 4 hours and left me feeling like I'd been dissected on my own living room floor. My mother spread the contents of her manila folder across my coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence in a murder trial. Dr. Hartwell had been thorough in her betrayal, providing not just general observations about my mental health, but specific details from our sessions that painted me as a dangerous, unstable person who couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. The notes included my admission about restricting my food intake to 800 calories a day during my junior year of college, the night I had cut my thighs with a razor blade after my first breakup, and the detailed account of swallowing 30 sleeping pills in my bathroom 6 months ago. These weren't casual mentions or therapeutic observations. These were verbatim quotes from our sessions, presented to my mother as evidence that I needed immediate family intervention and possibly involuntary psychiatric commitment. My father sat silently through most of the confrontation, occasionally nodding when my mother demanded his agreement but clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of her attack. He had always been the gentler parent, the one who tried to mediate between my mother's controlling instincts and my desperate need for independence. But faced with what appeared to be professional confirmation of my mental instability, he deferred to my mother's judgment about what needed to happen next. "You're coming home with us tonight," my mother declared as she gathered the papers back into her folder. "Dr. Hartwell recommended immediate family supervision, and we're not leaving you alone when you're clearly in crisis. You can take a leave of absence from work until you get the help you need." The assumption that I would simply comply with her demands, abandon my career and my independence based on a therapist's unauthorized disclosure, revealed how little my mother understood about the person I had become during my years in Denver. The frightened teenager who had once submitted to her every directive no longer existed. But I also realized that arguing would only reinforce their perception that I was unstable and resistant to help. Instead, I called my supervisor at Denver Marketing Solutions and requested an emergency meeting for the following morning. Marcus had been covering my responsibilities during the afternoon crisis, but I needed to explain the situation to someone who knew my actual mental state and could provide perspective on what was happening. I also needed to secure my job while I figured out how to fight this violation of my privacy and autonomy. The sleepless night that followed was filled with frantic internet research about patient confidentiality laws and therapist ethics violations. Colorado's mental health statutes were clear. Therapists could only disclose patient information without consent in cases of imminent danger to the patient or others, suspected child abuse, or court orders. None of these exceptions applied to my situation. I had been stable, engaged in treatment, and making consistent progress. There was no justification for Dr. Hartwell's decision to contact my family. The Colorado State Board of Psychology's website outlined the complaint process for ethics violations, requiring detailed documentation of the therapist's misconduct and evidence that professional standards had been breached. I began drafting a formal complaint, documenting every aspect of Dr. Hartwell's unauthorized disclosure and the impact it was having on my life and relationships. My parents spent the night in my apartment, my mother sleeping on my couch to ensure I didn't do anything dangerous while they were there. The surveillance felt suffocating after years of living independently, but it also strengthened my resolve to fight back against this violation of my rights. I wasn't the helpless teenager my mother remembered. I was an accomplished professional who had built a successful life through my own efforts, and I wasn't going to let a therapist's betrayal destroy everything I had worked to achieve. The meeting with my supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, took place at 7 a.m. in her office overlooking downtown Denver's business district. Jennifer was a 45-year-old marketing veteran who had mentored me since I joined the company 3 years earlier. She knew my work ethic, my professional capabilities, and my dedication to my clients. More importantly, she had observed my personal growth during my time at the company and could speak to my stability and reliability. I explained the situation carefully, emphasizing the violation of confidentiality rather than the specific details of my mental health history. Jennifer's response was immediate and supportive, offering to provide any documentation needed to demonstrate my professional competence and reliability. She also connected me with the company's legal counsel, who specialized in employment law but had experience with healthcare privacy violations. "This is completely unacceptable," Jennifer said after reviewing the basic facts of what had happened. "A therapist can't just call someone's family and disclose private medical information without consent. That's exactly the kind of violation that destroys people's trust in mental health care and prevents them from seeking help when they need it." Her validation meant more than I could express. After 12 hours of being treated like an unstable person who couldn't make rational decisions, having someone who knew me professionally confirm that Dr. Hartwell's actions were inappropriate helped restore my confidence that I wasn't overreacting or misunderstanding the situation. The company's legal counsel, David Kim, was even more direct in his assessment. He explained that healthcare privacy violations were serious federal offenses under HIPAA, with potential criminal penalties for providers who disclosed protected health information without authorization. He offered to review my case and determine whether I had grounds for a civil lawsuit in addition to the ethics complaint I was planning to file with the state board. Armed with professional support and legal validation, I returned to my apartment to confront my parents about their demands that I abandon my life and return to Fort Collins for family supervision. The conversation was explosive, with my mother accusing me of being in denial about my mental health and my father expressing concern that I was being reckless with my safety. "Dr. Hartwell wouldn't have called us if she wasn't genuinely worried about you," my mother insisted. "She's a professional with 15 years of experience. She knows when someone is in crisis better than you do." I produced copies of Colorado's confidentiality laws and the American Psychological Association's ethics code, showing them exactly how Dr. Hartwell's actions violated professional standards and federal privacy protections. My mother dismissed the documentation as legal technicalities that shouldn't override a therapist's professional judgment about patient safety. The argument continued for hours, with my parents refusing to leave until I agreed to some form of supervision or intervention. Finally, I proposed a compromise. I would continue working with my current psychiatrist, Dr. Amanda Chen, who had been prescribing my antidepressant medication and monitoring my progress for the past year. Dr. Chen could provide an independent assessment of my mental state and confirm whether there was any genuine cause for concern about my safety. My parents reluctantly agreed to this arrangement, but insisted on staying in Denver until Dr. Chen could meet with me and provide her evaluation. They checked into a hotel near my apartment, making it clear that they considered this a temporary solution while they determined what longer-term intervention might be necessary. The appointment with Dr. Chen took place the following afternoon at her practice in the Denver Tech Center. I explained the entire situation, including Dr. Hartwell's unauthorized disclosure and my parents' demands for family supervision. Dr. Chen was shocked by the breach of confidentiality and immediately offered to provide documentation of my mental health status and treatment compliance. "You've been one of my most stable and engaged patients," she said after reviewing my file and conducting a brief mental status evaluation. "Your antidepressant is working effectively, you've been consistent with your therapy appointments, and you've shown excellent insight into your mental health needs. There's absolutely no clinical justification for the kind of crisis intervention your parents are describing." Dr. Chen's written evaluation, which she provided the same day, confirmed that I was not in crisis, posed no danger to myself or others, and was actively engaged in appropriate mental health treatment. She explicitly stated that there was no medical or psychological basis for the family supervision my parents were demanding, and that such intervention could actually be harmful to my continued recovery. The evaluation should have ended my parents' concerns and allowed them to return to Fort Collins with confidence that I was safe and stable. Instead, my mother questioned Dr. Chen's qualifications and suggested that she might not have access to the complete picture of my mental health that Dr. Hartwell had observed during our therapy sessions. "She's only seen Emma for medication management," my mother argued. "Dr. Hartwell was doing intensive therapy and discovered things that Dr. Chen doesn't know about. We can't just ignore a therapist's professional recommendation based on a 15-minute appointment." The persistence of their concerns, despite professional evidence to the contrary, revealed that this wasn't really about my mental health or safety. This was about my mother's need to control my life and her unwillingness to accept that I had successfully built an independent existence without her oversight. Dr. Hartwell's violation of confidentiality had simply provided her with the ammunition she needed to justify boundary violations that she had been wanting to impose for years. The situation escalated when my mother contacted Dr. Hartwell directly to request additional information about my treatment and prognosis. Dr. Hartwell, apparently realizing that her initial disclosure might have created legal problems, refused to provide any further information and suggested that my parents consult with their own family therapist if they had concerns about how to support my mental health. This response enraged my mother, who interpreted Dr. Hartwell's newfound adherence to confidentiality as evidence that she was being pressured to hide important information about my condition. She began researching involuntary commitment procedures in Colorado, convinced that I was manipulating the mental health system to avoid getting the help I needed. The research into involuntary commitment laws revealed the difficulty of forcing psychiatric treatment on a competent adult who wasn't posing an immediate danger to themselves or others. Colorado required clear and convincing evidence of imminent risk, along with professional evaluation confirming that the person lacked capacity to make rational decisions about their treatment. Dr. Chen's evaluation had already established that I was competent and stable, making involuntary commitment essentially impossible, but my mother's investigation into these procedures had revealed another disturbing aspect of Dr. Hartwell's initial disclosure. She had apparently suggested to my mother that involuntary commitment might be necessary if I refused to accept family supervision. This wasn't just a breach of confidentiality. It was an attempt to manipulate my family into coercing me into treatment that wasn't medically necessary. I spent hours on the phone with David Kim, the company's legal counsel, discussing the implications of Dr. Hartwell's apparent recommendation for involuntary commitment. He explained that false or misleading statements to family members about a patient's need for psychiatric hospitalization could constitute professional misconduct beyond simple privacy violations. If she told your mother that you needed involuntary commitment when you were actually stable and engaged in treatment, that's not just a confidentiality breach, he explained. That's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation of your mental health status, and it could have resulted in serious legal and personal consequences for you. The gravity of the situation was becoming clearer. Dr. Hartwell hadn't just shared private information with my mother, she had apparently misrepresented my mental health status in ways that could have led to forced hospitalization and the destruction of my career and independence. The betrayal went far beyond a simple ethics violation to something approaching deliberate sabotage of my life and well-being. Meanwhile, my professional responsibilities continued to demand attention despite the personal crisis. The Henderson Industries presentation had been postponed due to my emergency situation, but the client was growing impatient with the delays and threatening to reconsider their contract with our agency. Marcus was doing his best to manage the account, but the campaign required my direct involvement and expertise. Jennifer offered to take over the Henderson account temporarily, but I knew that stepping away from such a major client would damage my reputation and potentially derail my career trajectory. I couldn't let Dr. Hartwell's betrayal destroy everything I had worked to build professionally, especially when her claims about my instability were completely unfounded. The pressure of maintaining my professional responsibilities while fighting for my personal autonomy was exhausting. I was sleeping 3 hours a night, surviving on caffeine and adrenaline, and struggling to focus on complex marketing strategies while my parents continued their campaign to convince me that I needed family supervision. The breaking point came when my mother threatened to contact my employer directly to discuss her concerns about my mental health and my fitness to handle the responsibilities of my position. The prospect of having my private medical information disclosed to my colleagues and clients was horrifying, and it made me realize that I needed to take more aggressive action to protect myself from further violations of my privacy. I called the Colorado State Board of Psychology and spoke with an investigator about expediting my complaint against Dr. Hartwell. The investigator, Sarah Martinez, explained that ethics violations involving unauthorized disclosure were taken very seriously and that the board would investigate my complaint promptly. She also mentioned that my case might not be the first complaint they had received about Dr. Hartwell's professional conduct. That revelation opened up an entirely new dimension to the situation. If other patients had experienced similar violations of confidentiality or professional misconduct, it suggested that Dr. Hartwell's betrayal of my trust wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of unethical behavior that needed to be stopped before more people were harmed. The coffee shop on East Colfax Avenue had become my sanctuary during the chaos following Dr. Hartwell's betrayal. The Grind Cafe was a small, independently owned establishment frequented by graduate students from the University of Colorado Denver and freelancers who needed reliable Wi-Fi and strong coffee. The constant buzz of conversation and clicking keyboards provided perfect cover for the sensitive phone calls I was making as I investigated what had happened to me. Sarah Martinez from the Colorado State Board of Psychology had been cryptic during our initial conversation, but her suggestion that other complaints might exist against Dr. Hartwell haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that other vulnerable patients had experienced similar violations of trust and privacy. If Dr. Hartwell was systematically breaching confidentiality or manipulating families into coercive interventions, the scope of harm could be enormous. 3 days after filing my formal complaint, I received a call from Martinez asking if I would be willing to speak with another complainant who had experienced similar misconduct. The suggestion that someone else had gone through what I was experiencing felt both validating and terrifying. Validating because it confirmed that my perception of Dr. Hartwell's behavior was accurate, terrifying because it meant other people had been harmed by someone they trusted with their most vulnerable moments. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at a neutral location downtown. Martinez couldn't provide details about the other complainant's case due to confidentiality restrictions, but she emphasized that both cases involved unauthorized disclosure of private therapeutic information to family members without patient consent. I arrived at the Denver Public Library's Central Branch 30 minutes early, using the time to review my documentation and prepare for what could be a difficult conversation. The main floor of the library bustled with the usual mix of students, job seekers, and people seeking shelter from Denver's unpredictable spring weather. I found a quiet table in the research section where we could talk without being overheard. The woman who approached my table at exactly 2 p.m. looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Claire Morrison appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and the kind of nervous energy that comes from prolonged stress and anxiety. She carried a leather messenger bag that looked stuffed with documents, and her eyes darted around the library as if she expected to be followed or observed. "Emma?" she asked quietly, settling into the chair across from me with obvious reluctance. Sarah Martinez said you might be willing to share your experience with Dr. Hartwell's behavior. The conversation that followed revealed a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond what I had experienced. Claire had been seeing Dr. Hartwell for postpartum depression following the birth of her second child 18 months earlier. Her therapy had focused on managing overwhelming anxiety about her ability to care for her newborn while maintaining her career as a freelance graphic designer. During their sessions, Claire had discussed her fears about being an inadequate mother, her struggles with breastfeeding, and her occasional thoughts about whether her children would be better off without her. These admissions were part of normal postpartum adjustment and didn't represent genuine suicidal ideation or intent to harm herself or her children. Dr. Hartwell had acknowledged this distinction during their sessions and had been helping Claire develop coping strategies for managing her anxiety, but 6 weeks ago, Dr. Hartwell had contacted Claire's husband, Michael, claiming that Claire was experiencing a psychotic episode and posed a danger to their children. She had recommended immediate removal of the children from Claire's care and suggested that Child Protective Services might need to be involved if the family didn't take action to ensure the children's safety. "She told my husband that I was having delusional thoughts about hurting the kids," Claire explained, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "She said I needed immediate psychiatric hospitalization and that the children shouldn't be alone with me until I was stable. None of that was true. I never said anything about hurting my children. I talked about feeling overwhelmed and worried. That I wasn't doing a good job, but that's completely different from being dangerous. The consequences for Claire had been devastating. Her husband, terrified by Dr. Hartwell's warnings, had moved the children to his mother's house and consulted with a divorce attorney about protecting them from what he believed was his wife's deteriorating mental state. Claire's access to her own children had been restricted based on a therapist's false characterization of her mental health status. Child Protective Services had indeed become involved after Michael contacted them seeking guidance about protecting the children from an allegedly unstable mother. Although the initial investigation had found no evidence of abuse or neglect, the mere existence of a CPS file had created a permanent record that could affect Claire's custody rights in any future legal proceedings. I lost my children for 3 weeks, Claire continued, tears streaming down her face. 3 weeks where I couldn't tuck them in at night, couldn't comfort them when they cried, couldn't be their mother because a therapist lied about what I had told her in confidence. My 2-year-old kept asking why mommy couldn't come home, and I had no way to explain it to him. The pattern emerging from Claire's experience was chillingly similar to my own, but with even more serious consequences. Dr. Hartwell had taken normal therapeutic disclosures about anxiety and fear, then misrepresented them to family members as evidence of dangerous mental illness requiring immediate intervention. The distortion wasn't accidental or the result of poor professional judgment. It was systematic misrepresentation that destroyed families and traumatized vulnerable patients. Claire had eventually been able to restore her relationship with her children after an independent psychiatric evaluation confirmed that she posed no danger to anyone and was responding well to appropriate treatment for postpartum depression. But the damage to her marriage was ongoing, with her husband struggling to trust her despite professional confirmation that Dr. Hartwell's warnings had been unfounded. Michael still watches me sometimes when I'm with the kids, Claire said quietly. He tries to hide it, but I can see him evaluating whether I'm acting strange or might be having one of the episodes that Dr. Hartwell warned him about. It's like living under surveillance in my own home, and I don't know how to rebuild trust that was destroyed by someone else's lies. The impact on Claire's professional life had been equally damaging. The stress of losing access to her children and fighting false accusations of mental instability had made it impossible to focus on her graphic design work. She had lost several major clients due to missed deadlines and inability to concentrate during the crisis. The financial strain had compounded the family stress and made it difficult to afford the legal help she needed to address Dr. Hartwell's misconduct. As we compared our experiences, disturbing similarities emerged beyond the basic violation of confidentiality. Dr. Hartwell had recommended involuntary psychiatric commitment in both cases, suggesting that we were dangers to ourselves or others despite evidence to the contrary. She had contacted family members with alarming characterizations of our mental health that bore little resemblance to what we had actually discussed in therapy. Most concerning, she had apparently coordinated with family members to pressure us into accepting treatment or supervision that wasn't medically necessary. She told Michael that I would probably deny everything if he confronted me about her concerns, Claire explained. She said that patients in my condition often lack insight into their own mental state and would resist help even when it was obviously needed. That made it impossible for me to defend myself, because my denial was predicted and framed as further evidence of my instability. The sophistication of Dr. Hartwell's manipulation was becoming apparent. She wasn't just breaching confidentiality impulsively or due to poor judgment, she was systematically undermining her patients' credibility while positioning herself as the only reliable source of information about their mental health. This created a dynamic where family members would trust her assessment over their loved one's own account of their experiences and mental state. I shared my own experience with Dr. Hartwell's apparent recommendation for involuntary commitment and her detailed disclosure of my therapeutic history to my mother. Claire was horrified to learn that the pattern extended beyond postpartum depression cases to other types of mental health treatment, suggesting that Dr. Hartwell's misconduct wasn't limited to a specific patient population or type of therapeutic issue. We need to find out if there are others, Claire said, her voice gaining strength as her initial nervousness gave way to determination. If she's doing this to multiple patients, there have to be other people who've been harmed. Some of them might not even realize that what happened to them was unethical or illegal. The possibility that other victims might not understand their rights or know how to file complaints was particularly troubling. Many people seeking mental health treatment are already vulnerable due to depression, anxiety, or trauma. They might accept a therapist's claims about needing family intervention or involuntary hospitalization without questioning whether the recommendation was appropriate or based on accurate assessment of their condition. Claire had brought copies of her own documentation, including the original complaint she had filed with the state board and records from the independent psychiatric evaluation that had cleared her. She also had correspondence from her divorce attorney, who had been shocked to learn that Dr. Hartwell's assessment of Claire's mental health had no basis in clinical reality. My attorney said she'd never seen a case where a therapist's false statements had caused so much damage to a family, Claire explained. She's representing me in a civil lawsuit against Dr. Hartwell for professional malpractice and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The attorney thinks we might be able to get class action status if there are enough victims. The mention of a civil lawsuit opened up possibilities I hadn't fully considered. While the state board complaint would address Dr. Hartwell's professional conduct and potentially result in disciplinary action, a civil lawsuit could provide financial compensation for the damage she had caused and might be more effective at preventing future harm to other patients. Claire's attorney, Linda Park, specialized in medical malpractice and professional misconduct cases. She had experience with healthcare privacy violations and understood the unique challenges of proving that a therapist had misrepresented a patient's mental health status to family members. According to Claire, Linda was eager to speak with other potential victims and had the resources to conduct a thorough investigation into Dr. Hartwell's practices. We spent the next hour comparing notes about Dr. Hartwell's therapeutic approach and office procedures, looking for additional patterns that might help identify other victims or explain how she was able to engage in systematic misconduct without detection. Several concerning details emerged from our comparison. Both of our cases involved Dr. Hartwell contacting family members during times when we were making significant progress in therapy and didn't require crisis intervention. This suggested that her decision to breach confidentiality wasn't based on genuine clinical concerns but might have been motivated by other factors. Dr. Hartwell had also been unusually interested in our family relationships and dynamics, spending considerable session time exploring conflicts with parents or spouses rather than focusing on the primary mental health issues that had brought us to therapy. In retrospect, this emphasis on family conflict seemed designed to gather information that could later be used to manipulate family members into coercive interventions. She asked a lot of questions about my relationship with my mother-in-law, Claire recalled. At the time, I thought she was helping me understand how family stress was affecting my postpartum depression. Now I wonder if she was figuring out who she could contact to undermine my credibility if she decided I needed to be controlled. The realization that Dr. Hartwell might have been systematically gathering information to use against us was deeply disturbing. It suggested a level of premeditation and manipulation that went far beyond simple professional misconduct. She appeared to be operating a practice designed to compromise patients' autonomy and independence rather than support their mental health and recovery. Claire had also discovered that Dr. Hartwell's practice was unusually expensive compared to other therapists in the Denver area, with session fees that were 40% higher than the average for similar providers. She required payment in advance and didn't accept insurance, making her services accessible only to patients with significant financial resources or family support. I always wondered why she was so expensive, Claire said. Now I'm thinking that maybe she targets patients who have family members with the resources to pay for extended treatment or hospitalization. If you're manipulating families into believing their loved one needs intensive intervention, it's more profitable if they can afford to pay for it. The financial motivation angle added another disturbing dimension to Dr. Hartwell's apparent misconduct. If she was deliberately creating crises that required expensive interventions, she would benefit financially from the chaos and trauma she was causing her patients. This would transform her practice from healthcare provision into a sophisticated exploitation scheme targeting vulnerable people and their families. As our conversation continued, Claire mentioned that she had been in contact with a private investigator who specialized in professional misconduct cases. The investigator, Tom Bradley, had experience working with attorneys on medical malpractice cases and knew how to document evidence of systematic professional violations. Tom thinks there might be a way to identify other patients who've been harmed, Claire explained. He has connections with people who work in the mental health system, and he knows how to research professional complaints and malpractice claims. If Dr. Hartwell has been doing this for years, there should be a trail of evidence we can follow. The prospect of conducting a systematic investigation into Dr. Hartwell's practices was both exciting and intimidating. It offered the possibility of exposing a pattern of misconduct that could protect future patients from similar harm, but it also meant deeper involvement in a complex legal and professional process that could take months or years to resolve. Before we parted ways, Claire and I exchanged contact information and agreed to coordinate our efforts in pursuing complaints and potential legal action against Dr. Hartwell. We also planned to meet with Linda Park together to discuss the possibility of a class action lawsuit and to share information with Tom Bradley about our experiences. I keep thinking about all the people who might be going through what we went through, Claire said as we gathered our materials to leave the library. If we don't stop her, she's going to keep destroying families and traumatizing people who trusted her to help them. We might be the only ones who have the resources and knowledge to fight back." The weight of that responsibility was sobering, but it also provided clarity about what needed to happen next. Dr. Hartwell's violation of my confidentiality had seemed like an isolated incident of professional misconduct. Now I understood that it was part of a systematic pattern of abuse that was continuing to harm other vulnerable patients and their families. The evidence was mounting that Dr. Hartwell wasn't just a therapist who had made poor professional decisions. She was someone who was deliberately exploiting the therapeutic relationship for personal gain while causing serious psychological and financial harm to the people who trusted her with their mental health care. The law offices of Park, Stevens and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Denver's financial district, with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains that reminded me how much my life had changed since this nightmare began. 6 weeks had passed since my meeting with Claire Morrison at the library, and what started as 2 isolated complaints had grown into something unprecedented in Colorado's mental health oversight system. Linda Park's conference room buzzed with controlled intensity as our legal team prepared for what would become the largest professional misconduct investigation in the state's history. The mahogany table was covered with documents, laptop computers, and evidence binders that told the stories of 17 different families whose lives had been devastated by Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's systematic abuse of the therapeutic relationship. 17 families. The number still shocked me every time Linda recited it during our strategy meetings. What Claire and I had initially thought might be a pattern affecting a few patients had revealed itself as an elaborate scheme spanning nearly 5 years and involving dozens of victims across Denver's most affluent neighborhoods. Tom Bradley, the private investigator Claire had mentioned, turned out to be a former FBI agent whose specialized knowledge of financial crimes and professional misconduct had been instrumental in uncovering the full scope of Dr. Hartwell's operation. His investigation had revealed connections between Hartwell Therapeutic Services and a network of private psychiatric facilities, family counselors, and legal consultants who benefited financially from the artificial crises she created in her patients' lives. "The pattern is consistent across all 17 cases," Tom explained, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that mapped out Dr. Hartwell's methodology. "She targets patients from high-income families, spends months gathering detailed information about family dynamics and financial resources, then creates a crisis that requires expensive intervention from her network of associates." The sophistication of the scheme was breathtaking. Dr. Hartwell had essentially built a professional referral network designed to extract maximum financial benefit from manufactured mental health emergencies. When she contacted family members with false or exaggerated claims about a patient's mental state, she simultaneously recommended specific facilities, consultants, and treatment programs that generated substantial referral fees for her practice. The financial records Tom had obtained through legal discovery showed that Dr. Hartwell's practice had received over $340,000 in referral fees and consultation payments during the past 3 years. These payments came from Riverside Behavioral Health, a private psychiatric facility that specialized in involuntary commitments, Mountain View Family Therapy, which provided expensive family counseling services, and Pinnacle Legal Advocacy, a firm that helped families navigate guardianship and conservatorship proceedings for allegedly incompetent relatives. My case had been part of this network, though I hadn't been successfully channeled into the full range of services. Dr. Hartwell's recommendation that my parents consider involuntary commitment would have led to a stay at Riverside Behavioral Health, followed by family therapy at Mountain View and potentially legal proceedings to establish my parents as my guardians. The total cost for this unnecessary intervention could have exceeded $200,000. Claire's situation had progressed further through the network before independent evaluation stopped the process. Her husband had already paid $15,000 for emergency family counseling sessions at Mountain View, and Pinnacle Legal had begun preparing guardianship documents that would have given him legal control over Claire's finances and medical decisions. Only the intervention of Claire's divorce attorney had prevented the complete destruction of her autonomy and civil rights, but other families hadn't been as fortunate. Jessica Williams, a 34-year-old teacher who had sought therapy for work-related stress, had spent 6 weeks at Riverside Behavioral Health after Dr. Hartwell convinced her parents that she was having a psychotic breakdown. The hospitalization had cost $180,000 and resulted in Jessica losing her teaching position due to extended absence. She was still fighting to restore her professional reputation and financial stability. 8 months later, Marcus Chen, a 26-year-old software engineer dealing with social anxiety, had been placed under a court-ordered guardianship after Dr. Hartwell testified that he lacked capacity to make rational decisions about his treatment. His parents now controlled his finances, his living situation, and his medical care based on false testimony about his mental state. Despite multiple independent evaluations confirming his competence, the guardianship remained in place due to legal complications and his family's belief that Dr. Hartwell's assessment was accurate. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also providing the evidence needed to build an airtight case against Dr. Hartwell and her network of associates. Linda Park had assembled a legal team that included specialists in medical malpractice, healthcare fraud, and civil rights violations. The complexity of the case required expertise in multiple areas of law, but the strength of the evidence made Linda confident that we could achieve both civil damages and criminal prosecution. This isn't just professional misconduct, Linda explained during one of our weekly strategy meetings. This is organized fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and potentially racketeering under federal RICO statutes. Dr. Hartwell and her associates have been operating an enterprise designed to defraud patients and their families while violating fundamental constitutional rights to liberty and due process. The federal implications of the case had attracted attention from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Agent Rachel Torres had been assigned to investigate the criminal aspects of Dr. Hartwell's scheme, working closely with our legal team to coordinate evidence gathering and witness interviews. My role in the investigation had evolved far beyond being a victim seeking justice for personal wrongs. I had become something of a coordinator for the other victims, helping them navigate the legal process and providing emotional support as they processed the trauma of discovering how thoroughly they had been manipulated and exploited. The support group meetings we organized took place every Tuesday evening in a conference room at the University of Colorado Denver's psychology department. Dr. Stephen Walsh, a professor of clinical ethics who had become an expert witness in our case, donated the space and provided professional guidance as 17 families worked through the psychological impact of Dr. Hartwell's betrayal. These meetings were both therapeutic and strategic. They allowed victims to share their experiences and realize they weren't alone in what had happened to them, but they also helped our legal team identify additional evidence and refine our understanding of how Dr. Hartwell's scheme operated. Each family's story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing new aspects of the conspiracy and strengthening our case for both civil and criminal prosecution. The emotional support aspect was crucial because many of the victims were struggling with trust issues that extended far beyond their relationship with Dr. Hartwell. When a mental health professional systematically violates the therapeutic relationship, it can create lasting damage to a person's ability to seek help and trust other providers. Several group members had stopped attending therapy entirely, afraid that other providers might similarly betray their confidence. My own recovery process had been complicated by the dual role of victim and advocate that I had assumed. While fighting for justice felt empowering and purposeful, it also meant constantly reliving the trauma of Dr. Hartwell's betrayal and confronting the scope of harm she had caused to other families. I had started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Maria Santos, who specialized in helping people recover from professional boundary violations and abuse of power. The sessions with Dr. Santos were helping me process not just the original trauma of Dr. Hartwell's confidentiality breach, but also the secondary trauma of learning about the systematic nature of her misconduct and the extensive harm she had caused to other vulnerable people. The weight of responsibility I felt for stopping her from hurting others was balanced by pride in the progress we were making toward accountability and justice. Meanwhile, my professional life had stabilized and actually flourished despite the ongoing legal proceedings. Jennifer Walsh at Denver Marketing Solutions had been incredibly supportive throughout the investigation, recognizing that my advocacy work demonstrated leadership qualities and ethical integrity that made me even more valuable to the company. The Henderson Industries account had not only been successfully retained but had expanded based on our innovative approach to crisis management during the period when I was dealing with the personal emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me that, while Dr. Hartwell had tried to destroy my autonomy and independence, the process of fighting back had actually strengthened my professional reputation and personal relationships. Colleagues who learned about my situation were impressed by my systematic approach to documenting evidence and building a coalition for change. The skills I was developing as an advocate were directly applicable to my marketing career, particularly in areas of strategic planning and stakeholder coordination. The investigation had also revealed important information about how Dr. Hartwell had been able to operate without detection for so long. The Colorado State Board of Psychology's oversight procedures had significant gaps that allowed practitioners to engage in systematic misconduct as long as they were careful about documentation and maintained relationships with other professionals. who benefited from their referrals. Sarah Martinez from the state board had become a key ally in our effort to expose these systemic weaknesses and implement reforms that would prevent future cases of organized professional misconduct. She was working with Linda Park and our legal team to develop new oversight procedures that would make it much more difficult for practitioners to operate referral schemes like Dr. Hartwell's. The current system relies too heavily on patients to file complaints when they've been harmed, Sarah explained during a meeting at the state board offices. But patients who are targeted by schemes like Dr. Hartwell's are often in vulnerable positions where they don't recognize what's happening to them or don't have the resources to fight back effectively. The reforms being developed included mandatory reporting requirements for financial relationships between practitioners and referral sources, random audits of patient files to identify unusual patterns of crisis referrals, and improved training for board investigators to recognize signs of systematic misconduct rather than isolated ethics violations. These systemic changes were perhaps the most important long-term outcome of our advocacy effort. While individual justice for the 17 affected families was crucial, preventing future victims from experiencing similar harm would have much broader impact on the integrity of Colorado's mental health system. The financial investigation conducted by Tom Bradley had revealed that Dr. Hartwell's scheme extended beyond simple referral fees to more complex financial arrangements with her network partners. She had invested in Riverside Behavioral Health as a limited partner, giving her direct financial interest in increasing admissions to the facility. She also owned real estate that was leased to Mountain View Family Therapy, creating additional income streams from the crisis interventions she manufactured. These financial entanglements made it clear that Dr. Hartwell's violations of professional ethics were motivated by substantial monetary gain rather than misguided clinical judgment. The evidence would support charges of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights, with potential prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. The class action lawsuit was progressing rapidly through the federal court system, with Judge Patricia Coleman presiding over pretrial motions and discovery proceedings. Dr. Hartwell's attorneys were attempting to have the case dismissed on technical grounds, arguing that the plaintiffs had failed to exhaust administrative remedies through the state board before pursuing civil litigation. Linda Park was confident that these dismissal motions would fail because the scope of Dr. Hartwell's misconduct went far beyond professional licensing violations to include federal crimes that were properly addressed through civil rights litigation. The judge's preliminary ruling suggested agreement with our legal team's position that the case involved constitutional violations that required federal court intervention. The discovery process was revealing additional evidence of Dr. Hartwell's systematic approach to patient exploitation. Email communications between her practice and the partner organizations showed detailed discussions about which patients were good candidates for crisis intervention based on their family financial resources and insurance coverage. These communications would provide powerful evidence of premeditation and conspiracy in the criminal trial. Perhaps most damaging were recorded phone conversations between Dr. Hartwell and administrators at Riverside Behavioral Health, discussing strategies for extending patient stays to maximize insurance reimbursements and out-of-pocket payments from families. These recordings, obtained through a whistleblower at the facility, showed clear evidence of healthcare fraud and patient abuse. The momentum building in both the civil and criminal cases was creating pressure on Dr. Hartwell and her associates to consider plea negotiations rather than risk trial on the full range of charges. Agent Torres had indicated that the FBI was prepared to offer reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation in exposing other similar schemes operating in different states. The possibility that Dr. Hartwell's operation was part of a larger network of fraudulent mental health providers was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant that our investigation could help protect victims across the country. Terrifying because it suggested that systematic abuse of vulnerable patients might be more widespread than anyone had previously realized. As we prepared for the next phase of litigation and criminal prosecution, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that first devastating phone call from my mother. What had started as a personal violation of my privacy and autonomy had evolved into leadership of a movement for accountability and reform in mental health care. The woman who had been told she needed family supervision was now coordinating a federal investigation that could transform how professional misconduct was detected and prevented. The rebuilding process hadn't just restored what Dr. Hartwell had tried to destroy, it had created something entirely new and more powerful than what had existed before. The coalition of victims, advocates, legal professionals, and reform-minded practitioners we had assembled represented a force for change that could protect countless future patients from similar exploitation. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver felt like a cathedral of justice as I walked through its marble corridors toward courtroom 4B, where 9 months of investigation and preparation would finally culminate in Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's day of reckoning. October 12, 2023, had arrived with the crisp autumn air that signals change in Colorado, and the media attention surrounding our case had transformed what began as a personal violation into a national conversation about healthcare fraud and patient rights. Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with journalists, legal observers, and mental health professionals filling every available seat. The gallery included representatives from state licensing boards across the country, who had come to observe proceedings that could reshape how professional misconduct was prosecuted nationwide. The 17 families whose lives had been devastated by Dr. Hartwell's scheme sat together in the front rows, a visible reminder of the human cost of systematic healthcare fraud. Dr. Hartwell entered the courtroom flanked by her legal team, led by prominent criminal defense attorney Robert Sterling, whose reputation for defending white-collar criminals had made him the obvious choice for someone facing federal conspiracy charges. She looked diminished from the confident professional I remembered from our therapy sessions, her usually perfect appearance replaced by the stress-worn expression of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing under the weight of irrefutable evidence. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Walsh, had spent 6 months building a case that would prove beyond reasonable doubt that Dr. Hartwell had operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to defraud patients and their families while violating fundamental constitutional rights. The evidence they had assembled was overwhelming, but today's hearing would determine whether Dr. Hartwell would accept a plea agreement or force the case to trial. Agent Rachel Torres from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit took the witness stand. First, her testimony providing the foundation for everything that would follow. She had supervised an investigation that uncovered financial records, recorded conversations, and documentary evidence proving that Dr. Hartwell had systematically violated patient confidentiality as part of an organized scheme to generate fraudulent referral income. The defendant's practice generated over $340,000 in referral fees and kickbacks during the 3-year period covered by our investigation, Agent Torres testified, referring to financial analysis prepared by the FBI's forensic accounting team. These payments came from facilities and practitioners who benefited when Dr. Hartwell manufactured crises that required expensive interventions for her patients. The financial evidence was damning, but it was the recorded conversations that truly exposed the calculated nature of Dr. Hartwell's scheme. The prosecution played audio recordings obtained through a whistleblower at Riverside Behavioral Health, revealing discussions between Dr. Hartwell and facility administrators about which patients were good candidates for crisis intervention based on their family financial resources and insurance coverage. We want to focus on patients whose families can afford extended stays. Dr. Hartwell's voice filled the courtroom through the audio system. The goal is to create a crisis that requires immediate hospitalization, followed by family therapy and possibly guardianship proceedings. The total revenue potential per case can exceed $200,000 if we manage the intervention properly. The recording continued with Dr. Hartwell discussing specific strategies for misrepresenting patient mental health status to family members, including techniques for making normal therapeutic disclosures sound like evidence of dangerous mental illness requiring immediate intervention. Her clinical knowledge was being weaponized against vulnerable patients who had trusted her with their most private struggles. Judge Coleman's expression grew increasingly stern as additional recordings revealed the scope of coordination between Dr. Hartwell and her network of associates. The conspiracy extended far beyond simple referral arrangements to include detailed planning of manufactured crises, coordination of false testimony for guardianship proceedings, and strategies for maximizing insurance reimbursements through fraudulent diagnoses. The testimony of Dr. Stephen Walsh, the clinical ethics professor who had become an expert witness in our case, provided crucial context for understanding how Dr. Hartwell's actions violated every principle of ethical therapeutic practice. His analysis of her patient files revealed systematic patterns of information gathering designed to identify vulnerabilities that could later be exploited for financial gain. Dr. Hartwell spent unusual amounts of session time exploring patients' family relationships and financial circumstances, Dr. Walsh explained to the court. This information was then used to target specific family members who could be manipulated into authorizing expensive interventions based on false representations of the patient's mental health status. The pattern was consistent across all 17 victim cases. Dr. Hartwell would build trust with patients over several months, gathering detailed information about family dynamics, financial resources, and existing conflicts that could be exploited. She would then create artificial crises by contacting family members with alarming misrepresentations of the patient's mental state, recommending immediate intervention through her network of associate providers. Claire Morrison took the witness stand to describe how Dr. Hartwell's false claims about postpartum psychosis had resulted in separation from her children and nearly destroyed her marriage. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the 3 weeks during which she was denied access to her own children based on a therapist's lies about her mental health and potential danger to her family. She told my husband that I was having delusional thoughts about harming our children, Claire testified, her words carrying the weight of a mother's anguish. None of that was true. I had never expressed any thoughts about hurting my children. I had talked about feeling overwhelmed and worried about being a good mother, which is completely normal for someone dealing with postpartum depression. The impact testimony continued with other victims describing how Dr. Hartwell's scheme had destroyed their relationships, careers, and financial stability. Jessica Williams explained how 6 weeks of unnecessary psychiatric hospitalization had cost her teaching position and left her family in debt. Marcus Chen described the ongoing legal battle to restore his civil rights after being placed under court-ordered guardianship based on false testimony about his mental competence. Each victim's story revealed new aspects of Dr. Hartwell's systematic approach to patient exploitation. She had studied each family's vulnerabilities and tailored her manipulation accordingly, demonstrating a level of premeditation that supported the prosecution's charges of conspiracy and organized fraud. The defense team's attempts to characterize Dr. Hartwell's actions as misguided clinical judgment rather than criminal fraud were undermined by the recorded conversations and financial evidence showing clear profit motives for her misconduct. Robert Sterling argued that his client had genuinely believed her interventions were necessary for patient safety, but the audio recordings revealed discussions about revenue targets and strategies for maximizing payments from manufactured crises. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling addressed the court during his opening argument. Dr. Hartwell may have made errors in professional judgment, but criminal intent requires proof that she deliberately set out to defraud patients and their families. Mental health professionals must make difficult decisions about patient safety, and sometimes those decisions can appear questionable in retrospect. The prosecution's response was swift and devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh played additional recordings that showed Dr. Hartwell explicitly acknowledging that her crisis interventions were financially motivated rather than clinically necessary. In one particularly damning conversation, she laughed about how easy it was to manipulate worried family members into authorizing expensive treatments. "You just have to know which buttons to push," Dr. Hartwell's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Parents will pay anything if they think their child is in danger, and spouses are terrified of missing signs of mental illness. Once you establish yourself as the expert on their family member's condition, they'll do whatever you recommend." The callousness revealed in these recordings shocked even experienced court observers who had seen numerous cases of professional misconduct. Dr. Hartwell wasn't just violating ethical guidelines, she was actively exploiting the love and concern that family members felt for their relatives, turning those emotions into weapons for financial manipulation. Tom Bradley, the private investigator whose work had uncovered much of the evidence against Dr. Hartwell, testified about the sophisticated nature of her operation and its connections to similar schemes in other states. His investigation had revealed that Dr. Hartwell was part of a larger network of fraudulent providers who shared strategies and resources for exploiting vulnerable patients. This wasn't an isolated case of professional misconduct, Bradley explained to the court. Dr. Hartwell was connected to similar operations in California, Texas, and Florida, all using variations of the same basic scheme to generate fraudulent revenue from manufactured mental health crises. The interstate connections elevated the case beyond state-level professional misconduct to federal racketeering charges that carried potential prison sentences of up to 20 years. The evidence showed that Dr. Hartwell had attended conferences and training sessions where fraudulent providers shared techniques for maximizing profits from vulnerable patient populations. The testimony of former employees from Dr. Hartwell's practice provided insider perspective on how the scheme operated on a day-to-day basis. Rebecca Martinez, who had worked as a receptionist at Hartwell Therapeutic Services for 2 years, described how she had been instructed to schedule crisis consultations with family members without patient knowledge or consent. Dr. Hartwell would tell me to call certain patients' family members and say that she had urgent concerns about their loved one's mental health, Martinez testified. "I was supposed to schedule these calls during times when the patient wouldn't be available to participate or object to the conversation." The systematic violation of patient confidentiality wasn't accidental or the result of poor judgment, it was a carefully orchestrated process designed to circumvent patients' rights and manipulate family members into authorizing expensive interventions. Martinez's testimony revealed that Dr. Hartwell had maintained detailed files on each patient's family members, including information about their financial resources, emotional vulnerabilities, and existing relationship conflicts, the clinical director at Riverside Behavioral Health, Dr. Amanda Foster, testified about the unusual referral patterns from Dr. Hartwell's practice and the pressure she had felt to accept patients who didn't meet standard criteria for involuntary commitment. Her testimony revealed how Dr. Hartwell had coached facility staff on documenting false symptoms that would justify extended hospital stays. Dr. Hartwell would provide very specific language for our intake assessments, Dr. Foster explained. She would tell us exactly what symptoms to document and how to present them to justify the level of care she was recommending. Looking back, it's clear that these assessments were designed to support billing rather than provide accurate clinical evaluations. The revelation that medical records had been systematically falsified to support fraudulent treatments added document fraud charges to the already extensive list of criminal counts against Dr. Hartwell. The prosecution demonstrated that patient files had been altered retroactively to create false evidence of mental health crises that had never actually occurred. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Dr. Hartwell's defense strategy was collapsing under the weight of evidence that demonstrated premeditation, coordination, and systematic deception. The recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimony created an overwhelming case for criminal conviction that would likely result in substantial prison time. Judge Coleman called a recess to allow Dr. Hartwell and her attorneys to consider a plea agreement that had been offered by the prosecution. The terms included cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar schemes in other states, restitution to victims, and a recommended sentence of 12 to 15 years. In federal prison, during the recess, I found myself surrounded by reporters asking for my reaction to the day's revelations. The media attention had been overwhelming throughout the investigation, but today felt different because the evidence was finally being presented in a formal legal proceeding that would result in accountability and justice. Dr. Hartwell violated the trust of vulnerable people who came to her for help, I told the assembled journalists. But this case is about more than one therapist's misconduct. It's about systemic failures and oversight that allowed this scheme to operate for years without detection. We need reforms that will prevent future cases and protect patients' rights. The broader implications of our case were already being felt across the mental health profession. State licensing boards in 14 states had implemented new oversight procedures based on recommendations from our investigation. Professional associations were revising ethics codes to address financial conflicts of interest and improve protection for patient confidentiality. Medical schools were incorporating new training modules about recognizing and preventing systematic professional misconduct. When court reconvened after the recess, Robert Sterling announced that his client would accept the prosecution's plea agreement rather than proceed to trial. Dr. Hartwell stood to formally acknowledge her guilt on charges of healthcare fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, and money laundering. Your Honor, Dr. Hartwell's voice was barely audible as she addressed the court. I accept responsibility for my actions and the harm I have caused to my patients and their families. I violated the trust that was placed in me, and I understand that my conduct was criminal rather than simply unethical. The formal plea hearing would take place in 2 weeks, followed by sentencing that would likely result in Dr. Hartwell spending the next 12 to 15 years in federal prison. More importantly, her cooperation with ongoing investigations would help prosecutors identify and prosecute similar schemes in other states, potentially protecting thousands of future patients from similar exploitation. As I left the courthouse that afternoon, surrounded by the other victims whose courage had made this day possible, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and closure. The woman who had been told she needed family supervision 9 months earlier had become the leader of an investigation that exposed systematic healthcare fraud and protected vulnerable patients across the country. The revelation phase of our journey was complete, but the transformation it had created would continue affecting mental health practices and patient protection for years to come. Dr. Hartwell's scheme had been exposed, her network dismantled, and systemic reforms implemented that would prevent future cases of organized professional misconduct. Sometimes the people who try to destroy your autonomy and independence don't realize they're actually creating the conditions for unprecedented accountability and reform. Sometimes the violation of trust becomes the foundation for stronger protections and more ethical practices. Today, justice had been served, but more importantly, the future was safer for every vulnerable person seeking mental health treatment. The sentencing hearing took place on a snow-covered December morning that painted Denver in pristine white, as if the city itself was preparing for a fresh start. Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom was once again filled to capacity, but this time the atmosphere carried a different energy, not the tense anticipation of revelation, but the solemn gravity of justice being served after months of systematic legal proceedings. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the professional attire that had once projected authority and trustworthiness. She had spent the past 6 weeks in federal custody after her bail was revoked when investigators discovered she had attempted to liquidate offshore accounts containing additional fraudulent proceeds. The woman who had once controlled the lives and mental health of vulnerable patients now moved with the shuffle of someone whose own autonomy had been stripped away by the consequences of her crimes. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum, filed 3 days earlier, had requested the maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison based on the scope of Dr. Hartwell's criminal enterprise and the devastating impact on her victims. Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Walsh had documented how the scheme had affected not just the 17 primary victims, but dozens of family members whose lives had been shattered by manufactured crises and false accusations of mental illness. The defendant systematically exploited the therapeutic relationship for personal financial gain while causing immeasurable psychological harm to vulnerable patients and their families, Walsh addressed the court during her opening remarks. Her conduct represents one of the most egregious violations of professional trust in Colorado's legal history, and the sentence should reflect the severity of her crimes and the need to deter similar conduct by other healthcare providers. The victim impact statements began with Claire Morrison, who had flown in from Seattle where she had relocated with her children after rebuilding her life following the destruction caused by Dr. Hartwell's false accusations. Claire's voice remained steady as she described the ongoing effects of being separated from her children and the continued struggle to rebuild trust within her family. "My 2-year-old son still asks why mommy had to go away," Claire told the court, her words carrying the weight of a mother's anguish. "He doesn't understand that a person we trusted to help our family instead tried to destroy it for money. The psychological damage extends far beyond the financial costs, and my children will carry these scars for the rest of their lives." Jessica Williams spoke next, describing how the unnecessary psychiatric hospitalization had not only cost her teaching career but had created a permanent mark on her professional record that continued to affect her employment opportunities. Despite independent evaluations confirming that she had never required inpatient treatment, the stigma of the fabricated mental health crisis followed her to job interviews and professional references. "Dr. Hartwell didn't just steal money from my family," Jessica explained to the court. "She stole my career, my reputation, and my confidence in the mental health system that I had turned to for help. Every time I consider seeking therapy for the trauma she caused, I remember how completely she betrayed my trust, and I wonder if I can ever feel safe with a therapist again." Marcus Chen's impact statement revealed the ongoing legal battle to restore his civil rights after being placed under court-ordered guardianship based on Dr. Hartwell's false testimony. Despite multiple independent evaluations confirming his mental competence, the guardianship had proven difficult to dissolve due to legal procedures that favored maintaining protective arrangements once they were established. "I am a 27-year-old software engineer who has never been violent, never threatened anyone, and never shown any signs of being unable to manage my own affairs," Marcus told the court. "Yet because of Dr. Hartwell's lies, my parents still control my finances, my medical decisions, and where I can live. The legal system that was supposed to protect me has become the instrument of my continued victimization." The cumulative effect of 17 victim impact statements created a devastating portrait of the human cost of Dr. Hartwell's systematic fraud. Families had been torn apart, careers destroyed, and fundamental trust in the mental health system shattered by someone who had taken an oath to do no harm, but had instead operated an elaborate scheme to exploit vulnerable people for personal profit. The financial restitution calculations presented by the prosecution totaled over $2.8 million in direct damages, including fraudulent medical bills, legal fees incurred by families fighting false allegations, lost income from career disruption, and ongoing therapy costs for victims working to recover from the trauma of professional betrayal. This figure didn't include the immeasurable psychological damages that would affect victims and their families for years to come. Dr. Hartwell's cooperation with federal investigators had led to the identification and prosecution of similar schemes in 4 other states, resulting in additional arrests and the protection of hundreds of potential future victims. Her detailed information about the interstate network of fraudulent providers had enabled the FBI to shut down operations in California, Texas, Florida, and Arizona that were using variations of the same basic scheme to exploit vulnerable patients. The cooperation had also revealed the existence of training materials and conferences where fraudulent providers shared techniques for maximizing profits from manufactured mental health crises. These materials, distributed through encrypted communication networks, included detailed instructions for identifying vulnerable patients, manipulating family members, and documenting false symptoms to justify expensive interventions. Agent Rachel Torres testified about the broader impact of Dr. Hartwell's cooperation on national healthcare fraud prevention efforts. The information she had provided had enabled federal agencies to identify systemic vulnerabilities in mental health oversight that were being exploited by criminal enterprises across the country. The defendant's cooperation has been instrumental in exposing a nationwide network of healthcare fraud that was generating tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent revenue, Agent Torres explained to the court. Her information has led to the protection of an estimated 1,200 potential victims and the recovery of over $15 million in fraudulent proceeds. The defense team's plea for leniency focused on Dr. Hartwell's cooperation with authorities and her expression of remorse for the harm she had caused. Robert Sterling argued that his client had accepted responsibility for her crimes and was working to make amends through her assistance to federal investigators. Dr. Hartwell understands the magnitude of her crimes and the devastating impact on her victims, Sterling told the court. Her cooperation with federal authorities has been complete and has resulted in the protection of hundreds of future victims. We respectfully request that the court consider this cooperation when determining an appropriate sentence. However, the prosecution countered that Dr. Hartwell's cooperation had been motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse, noting that she had only begun cooperating after being confronted with overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Walsh pointed out that Dr. Hartwell had continued operating her fraudulent scheme even after becoming aware that victims were filing complaints and seeking legal action. The defendant's cooperation came only after she realized that conviction was inevitable, Walsh argued. She continued harming patients even when she knew that investigations were underway, demonstrating a callous disregard for victim welfare that should not be rewarded with a reduced sentence. The moment arrived when Dr. Hartwell was given the opportunity to address the court directly before sentencing. She approached the podium slowly, her hands shaking as she prepared to speak to the victims whose lives she had systematically destroyed for personal financial gain. Your Honor, I stand before you today with the knowledge that my actions have caused immeasurable harm to people who trusted me with their most vulnerable moments. Dr. Hartwell's voice cracked as she spoke. I violated every principle of the therapeutic relationship and betrayed the oath I took to help rather than harm my patients. She continued for several minutes, acknowledging specific victims by name and expressing awareness of how her scheme had affected their families, careers, and mental health. The apology felt rehearsed and calculated, lacking the emotional authenticity that might have suggested genuine remorse rather than strategic positioning for a reduced sentence. I cannot undo the harm I have caused, but I am committed to continuing my cooperation with federal authorities to ensure that other victims of similar schemes receive justice and protection, she concluded. I accept whatever sentence the court deems appropriate and will spend the rest of my life working to make amends for my crimes. Judge Coleman's sentencing remarks were thorough and uncompromising, reflecting her understanding of the case's broader implications for healthcare integrity and patient protection. She emphasized that the sentence needed to reflect not just the specific harm caused to the 17 victim families, but the systemic threat that organized healthcare fraud posed to public trust in mental health treatment. Dr. Hartwell's crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the therapeutic relationship and a systematic exploitation of vulnerable patients for personal financial gain, Judge Coleman stated. The scope and sophistication of her criminal enterprise, combined with the devastating impact on victims and their families, demands a sentence that reflects the gravity of these offenses and serves as a deterrent to other healthcare providers who might consider similar criminal conduct. The judge sentenced Dr. Hartwell to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release during which she would be prohibited from practicing any form of healthcare or counseling. The sentence exceeded the prosecution's recommended range, reflecting the court's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of systematic healthcare fraud. In addition to the prison sentence, Dr. Hartwell was ordered to pay $2.8 million in restitution to victims and to forfeit all assets derived from her criminal enterprise, including her practice, real estate investments, and offshore accounts. The forfeited assets would be liquidated to provide additional compensation to victims and to fund healthcare fraud prevention programs. The professional consequences were equally severe. The Colorado State Board of Psychology had already revoked Dr. Hartwell's license permanently, and similar actions were being taken by licensing boards in all states where she had been credentialed. The American Psychological Association had expelled her from membership and added her to a national database of practitioners banned from professional practice due to criminal conduct. The broader regulatory response to Dr. Hartwell's case had resulted in sweeping reforms to mental health oversight systems across the country. 14 states had implemented new mandatory reporting requirements for financial relationships between practitioners and referral sources. Federal agencies had established new audit procedures for detecting patterns of unnecessary mental health interventions and fraudulent billing practices. The case had also prompted changes in how mental health facilities evaluate emergency admissions and involuntary commitments. Riverside Behavioral Health and similar facilities nationwide had implemented new protocols requiring independent evaluation of patients referred for crisis intervention, reducing the likelihood that manufactured emergencies could result in unnecessary hospitalization. Medical schools and professional training programs had incorporated new curriculum modules focused on recognizing and preventing systematic healthcare fraud. The case studies developed from Dr. Hartwell's scheme were being used to train future mental health professionals about the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries and reporting suspicious practices by colleagues. As I left the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by the other victims whose courage had made this day possible, I felt a profound sense of closure and accomplishment. The woman who had been told she needed family supervision 14 months earlier had led an investigation that resulted in one of the most significant healthcare fraud prosecutions in Colorado's history. The financial recovery for victims was substantial, but more importantly, the systemic reforms implemented as a result of our case would protect thousands of future patients from similar exploitation. The accountability we had achieved extended far beyond individual justice to create lasting change in how mental health professionals are monitored and how patient rights are protected. The reckoning was complete, but the transformation it had created would continue affecting mental health practices and patient protection for decades to come. Dr. Hartwell would spend the next 18 years in federal prison, but her victims had reclaimed their lives and created a legacy of reform that would prevent countless others from experiencing similar betrayal and exploitation. 3 years had passed since the sentencing hearing that closed the chapter on Dr. Rebecca Hartwell's criminal enterprise, and the view from my new office window in Washington, D.C. provided a daily reminder of how completely my life had transformed since that devastating phone call from my mother in March 2022. The cherry blossoms along the Potomac River were in full bloom, their delicate beauty reflecting the renewal and growth that had emerged from the ashes of personal trauma and professional betrayal. The Department of Health and Human Services had created a new position specifically for me, Director of Mental Health Ethics and Patient Protection, a role that combined federal oversight responsibilities with advocacy for systemic reforms in healthcare fraud prevention. The appointment had been announced in a White House ceremony attended by congressional leaders, patient advocacy groups, and mental health professionals from across the country who had followed our case and supported the resulting reforms. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The 2 years following Dr. Hartwell's sentencing had been filled with congressional testimony, academic conferences, and collaboration with state licensing boards as the reforms we had fought for were implemented nationwide. The work was demanding and often emotionally challenging, but it provided a sense of purpose that had grown directly from the trauma of discovering how vulnerable patients could be exploited by trusted professionals. My daily responsibilities now included overseeing a team of 43 investigators, attorneys, and healthcare analysts who worked to identify and prevent systematic fraud in mental health treatment programs. We had developed sophisticated data analysis tools that could detect patterns of unnecessary interventions, fraudulent billing practices, and suspicious referral networks before they could harm large numbers of patients. The patient protection initiative that emerged from our case had become a model for healthcare oversight that was being adopted internationally. Delegations from the European Union, Canada, and Australia had visited our offices to study the protocols we had developed for detecting and preventing organized healthcare fraud. The systems we created were protecting an estimated 2.3 million patients annually from various forms of professional exploitation and abuse. The legislative impact had been equally significant. The Mental Health Professional Accountability Act, passed by Congress 18 months after Dr. Hartwell's sentencing, had established federal standards for professional licensing, mandatory reporting requirements for financial conflicts of interest, and whistleblower protections for healthcare workers who reported misconduct. The law had bipartisan support because it addressed patient protection concerns that transcended political boundaries. Senator Patricia Williams, who had sponsored the legislation, credited our case with providing the concrete evidence needed to convince her colleagues that federal intervention was necessary to protect vulnerable patients from systematic exploitation. The bill had passed with overwhelming majorities in both chambers, reflecting broad recognition that the problems we had exposed required comprehensive federal response. Emma Rodriguez and the other victims in the Hartwell case demonstrated incredible courage in exposing systematic healthcare fraud that was harming vulnerable patients across multiple states, Senator Williams had said during the bill signing ceremony. Their advocacy has resulted in the most comprehensive patient protection legislation in our nation's history. The academic recognition had been equally rewarding. 3 major universities had offered me faculty positions to develop new programs in healthcare ethics and patient advocacy. I had chosen to maintain my federal role while accepting a part-time professorship at Georgetown University's School of Medicine, where I taught courses on professional accountability and systematic fraud prevention. The students in my classes were future doctors, nurses, and mental health professionals who would be responsible for maintaining ethical standards in their own practices and reporting misconduct when they encountered it. Many had chosen healthcare careers specifically because they wanted to help people, and our discussions about professional responsibility and patient protection helped them understand how to maintain those ideals throughout their careers. The Hartwell case demonstrates that individual healthcare providers have the power to either protect or exploit vulnerable patients, I would tell each new class. Your professional obligations extend beyond providing competent care to include protecting the integrity of the healthcare system itself by reporting misconduct and advocating for patient rights. The research component of my academic work had produced findings that were reshaping how healthcare institutions approached ethics training and misconduct prevention. Our analysis of systematic fraud patterns had identified early warning signs that could help institutions detect and prevent organized exploitation before it could harm patients. The international speaking engagements had taken me to medical conferences in 17 countries, where healthcare leaders were grappling with similar challenges of professional accountability and patient protection. The principles we had developed for detecting and preventing systematic fraud were being adapted for different healthcare systems and legal frameworks around the world. The personal healing process had been as transformative as the professional recognition. Working with Dr. Maria Santos, my new therapist, had helped me process not just the original trauma of Dr. Hartwell's betrayal, but also the secondary trauma of learning about the systematic nature of her misconduct and the extensive harm she had caused to other families. You've transformed a personal violation into a force for protecting countless other people, Dr. Santos had observed during one of our sessions. That kind of transformation requires extraordinary resilience and demonstrates how trauma can become the foundation for meaningful advocacy and social change. The relationship with my family had undergone its own transformation. My mother, Patricia Rodriguez, had eventually acknowledged that her response to Dr. Hartwell's false claims had been driven by fear rather than rational assessment of my mental health and capabilities. The legal proceedings had educated her about patient confidentiality rights and the ways that families could be manipulated by unethical professionals. I realize now that I let my worry about you override my respect for your autonomy and privacy, she had written in a letter that arrived 6 months after Dr. Hartwell's sentencing. Dr. Hartwell exploited my love for you to justify violations that I should have questioned rather than supported. The process of rebuilding trust with my parents had been gradual but ultimately successful. They had attended several family therapy sessions with Dr. Santos, where we worked through the dynamics that had made our family vulnerable to Dr. Hartwell's manipulation. The experience had actually strengthened our relationships by establishing clearer boundaries and better communication about my mental health and independence. My father had become one of my strongest supporters, attending congressional hearings and speaking publicly about how families could be educated to recognize and resist manipulation by unethical healthcare providers. His perspective as a parent who had been deceived by false professional claims added credibility to our advocacy efforts and helped other families understand how they could protect their loved ones from similar exploitation. The support group for victims of healthcare professional misconduct had evolved into a national organization that provided resources and advocacy for people who had experienced various forms of professional betrayal and abuse. The Healthcare Abuse Survivors Network now had chapters in 32 states and had helped over 800 families navigate legal proceedings and access appropriate therapeutic support. Claire Morrison had become the organization's executive director, channeling her experience with Dr. Hartwell's scheme into leadership that was helping other families understand their rights and options when healthcare professionals violated their trust. Her work had been instrumental in passing patient protection legislation in 12 states and establishing victim support programs funded by healthcare fraud recoveries. We've created something that didn't exist when we needed it most, Claire had said during the organization's 3rd annual conference. No family should have to navigate healthcare professional misconduct alone, and no victim should have to wonder whether what happened to them was actually criminal rather than simply unethical. The financial recovery from our civil lawsuit had been substantial, with each victim family receiving compensation that reflected both direct damages and the psychological harm caused by Dr. Hartwell's systematic fraud. More importantly, the lawsuit had established legal precedents that made it easier for future victims to pursue accountability through civil litigation when healthcare professionals violated their trust. The precedent had already been cited in successful lawsuits against healthcare providers in 8 other states. resulting in additional millions of dollars in victim compensation and deterrent effects that were making other potential fraudsters reconsider engaging in systematic patient exploitation. The technology component of our reforms had produced innovative tools for detecting healthcare fraud before it could harm large numbers of patients. The data analysis systems we had developed could identify unusual patterns of crisis referrals, suspicious financial relationships between providers, and other indicators of potential systematic misconduct. These tools were being used by insurance companies, state licensing boards, and federal agencies to monitor healthcare practices and intervene when patterns suggested possible fraud or abuse. The early detection capabilities had already prevented an estimated $47 million in fraudulent healthcare spending while protecting thousands of patients from unnecessary interventions. The media attention surrounding our case had evolved from sensational coverage of the criminal proceedings to thoughtful analysis of the systemic issues we had exposed and the reforms that had resulted. Documentary filmmakers, investigative journalists, and academic researchers had produced detailed examinations of how organized healthcare fraud operated and how it could be prevented. The Netflix documentary, Betrayed, the Dr. Hartwell Case, had been viewed by over 12 million people worldwide, educating the public about patient rights and the warning signs of healthcare professional misconduct. The film had sparked conversations in families across the country about how to recognize and respond to potential professional boundary violations. The professional recognition had included awards from the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Workers, and the International Association of Healthcare Fraud Investigators. But the recognition that meant the most came from individual letters and emails from people who had been protected from similar exploitation because of the reforms we had fought to implement. "Your advocacy saved my family from a situation that could have destroyed our lives," one mother had written after healthcare fraud investigators shut down a scheme similar to Dr. Hartwell's in Phoenix. "We will never know your name, but your courage protected us from experiencing the trauma you survived." The ripple effects continued expanding in ways that were both inspiring and humbling. Medical schools were requiring new courses in professional ethics and systematic fraud prevention. State licensing boards had implemented oversight procedures that made organized misconduct much more difficult to sustain without detection. Healthcare facilities had established protocols for independent verification of crisis referrals and emergency interventions. Most importantly, patients and families were better educated about their rights and more empowered to question healthcare recommendations that seemed suspicious or inappropriate. The culture of unquestioning deference to healthcare authority was being replaced by informed advocacy and appropriate skepticism when providers' recommendations didn't align with patients' experiences and needs. As I prepared for another day of congressional testimony about healthcare fraud prevention, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from personal devastation to national leadership in patient protection. The woman who had been told she needed family supervision had become the architect of federal policies protecting millions of vulnerable patients from systematic exploitation. The phone call from my mother that had seemed to end my world had actually begun a transformation that created something far more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have achieved within the system that had tried to silence me. Sometimes the people who try to destroy your autonomy don't realize they're planting the seeds of unprecedented accountability and reform. Sometimes the violation of trust becomes the foundation for stronger protections and more ethical practices. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is refusing to remain silent when we witness misconduct. Even when speaking truth to power comes at enormous personal cost. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every patient who received ethical treatment, every family protected from manipulation, every healthcare provider who maintained professional boundaries because they understood the consequences of violation, all of it traced back to the courage required to fight systematic injustice even when the odds seemed impossible. The woman Dr. Hartwell had tried to control in silence had become the voice for millions of patients who deserved better protection and more ethical care. That transformation would continue protecting vulnerable people for generations to come. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.